This story contains distressing details, particularly for First Nations people. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Lucy Tassell.
I'm Emma Gillespie.
The Northern Territory Coroner has handed down the long-awaited findings in the inquest into the killing of 19-year-old Warlpiri-Luritja man Kumanjayi Walker by then police officer Zachary Rolfe. The coroner has found that Rolfe was a racist, embedded in a racist culture at Northern Territory Police, and that Walker's death was avoidable. In today's podcast, we'll explain the coroner's findings about Rolfe and Walker's lives and her recommendations to the Territory Government and police.
Lucy, it's hard to believe it's been 6 years since the death of Kumanjayi Walker. This story has really dominated headlines or been kind of omnipresent in the news cycle ever since.
Yeah.
For many reasons. There's been a court case, there's been criminal investigations, and of course this inquest, which reached a conclusion this week with the final report from the coroner. All of that is to say, this has been a really long time coming. So can you give us a bit of a sense of the timeline of the past 6 years to help us kind of understand where this has all come from?
Yeah, so this really begins on the 9th of November 2019. That's when Northern Territory Police Officer Zachary Rolfe entered a home in the remote town of Yuendumu with his colleague Adam Eberl. He was there to arrest Kumanjayi Walker, who had left an alcohol rehab facility to attend a family funeral. The arrest went wrong. Feels like an understatement, but it went very badly wrong. In a physical altercation, Walker stabbed Rolfe in the shoulder with a pair of surgical scissors. While Eberl was trying to restrain Walker, Rolfe shot him several times. Walker was then taken to Yuendumu police station where he died. Rolfe was tried and found not guilty of murdering Walker in March 2022. To the concern of Walker's family, the jury had no Aboriginal members. A coronial inquest, the one that we're talking about today, began in September of that year. So September 2022 to the present is the time that this inquest has been taking place.
Okay, so just to recap, in 2019, two Northern Territory police officers arrest Kumanjayi Walker. During that arrest, there is a physical altercation. Kumanjayi Walker ends up being shot several times by Zachary Rolfe, then later dies in police custody at the station in Yuendumu. What is a coronial inquest, Lucy? What does that all involve?
Yeah, I think it's important to specify that it's not a trial. It's not carried out by a judge. It can't make a finding of guilt or innocence. It's something that can happen before or after a trial. And basically, it's held when someone dies in circumstances that are not readily explainable or in very specific circumstances. So if say an 85-year-old was to die in their sleep, that wouldn't be cause for a coronial inquest.
Okay.
But other forms of deaths are the subject of these. In the Northern Territory, they're held when a person dies in, quote, unexpected, unnatural or violent circumstances, including when a person was held in or immediately before death was held in care or custody.
Okay. So you mentioned that a coronial inquest is not a criminal court hearing, but we'll hear the coroner's court referred to in these kinds of stories, but we're not talking about the kind of court we might think of.
Yeah, they can't sentence someone they can't find someone guilty of a crime or sentence them to jail or anything like that. They can only make findings about the person's death, and they can also make recommendations to improve public health and safety as a result of what they've found. So, for example, if a house burns down, the coroner might investigate the causes of the house burning down and make recommendations to prevent further houses from burning down in similar ways.
Okay. That makes sense. So you mentioned that this inquest began in September 2022, at that point, 3 years after Kumanjayi Walker's death, and it's now been another 3 years. It's been quite a long-running inquest. What did it involve, and bluntly, why did it take so long?
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons. The main reason why it took so long is that there was a lot to investigate and a lot to understand. The inquest had many rounds of hearings. It heard from a lot of different people. It heard from people in Yuendumu on the day that Kumanjayi Walker was shot and then died. It heard from NT police. So its rounds of hearings were September to November 2022, then again in early 2023, and then again another 3 sets of hearings in 2024. And
okay, so it hasn't been consistently running week in, week out for 3 years.
no,
Okay.
in the same way that you might think of, I know yesterday we were talking about the trial of Erin Patterson.
Yeah.
So that ran straight through for 10 weeks. This is different. This is as different kinds of people become available to
Okay.
come to the coroner in Alice Springs, then there were different sets of hearings, or as the coroner had different questions to ask or things to investigate. So the first thing I want to touch on is the kind of evidence that the coroner, her name is Elisabeth Armitage. So the kind of evidence that she was looking at, she expanded her scope of reference to look into racism in the NT police force while the inquest was ongoing. She said one of the reasons she examined evidence about racism in the force was, quote, to investigate whether Mr. Rolfe, so that's Zachary Rolfe, the police officer,
Yep.
held racist attitudes towards Aboriginal people, and if he did, whether his conduct was influenced by that racism in a way that increased the likelihood of death. Because, as I said, the coroner's job is to find out the reasons why a person died, what happened when a person died, and then to make recommendations to avoid that situation in the future. So she was trying to find out why Rolfe shot Walker and to make recommendations about the NT police's approach. And she found that evidence of racism in the force was relevant because it allowed her to make recommendations about how the police approaches Aboriginal people that it's seeking to arrest.
Okay. So Rolfe, the officer in question, he was actually questioned throughout this inquest, or he was called upon to give his version of events and face questioning from Elisabeth Armitage. What happened there?
He sought to avoid appearing at the inquest during its first year of hearings.
Okay.
He made legal appeals to avoid having to face the inquest. At that point, he had already been through the criminal trial that had acquitted him of murder. So he was seeking to avoid appearing at the inquest. He did speak eventually in February 2024. He had been granted, quote, self-incrimination protection. This meant that he couldn't face legal consequences for admissions that he made. And again, as I said, it's not a trial. He had already been through a trial and had been acquitted.
Okay.
But his legal team had sought for there to be protections from any further possibility of criminal charges around things that he might say.
Okay, so he was cleared of those murder charges. He did not want to appear at the inquest, but eventually agreed to on the grounds that basically anything he said would not result in further criminal proceedings.
Yes.
Knowing that this inquest did go on for so long
Yeah.
and heard from so many different people, different stakeholders, community representatives, law enforcement representatives, can you give us some of the key findings?
So, I mean, even within things that I would consider the key findings, there's a lot to break down. When we got the inquest document, which is more than 600 pages, I said to you, wow, there's just so much here and all of it is important. So I'll start with what the coroner heard at the inquest and what she has found about Kumanjayi Walker himself. He was 19 when he died, which we knew. He had been exposed to substances including alcohol, cannabis, and sniffing petrol since he was at least 13. At least part of his childhood had involved violence within the family unit. He couldn't cope with normal school. He had issues with his hearing that also weren't adequately treated when he was a child. A psychologist who worked with him when he was a teenager found Walker had no ability to regulate his emotions and was very disconnected from his body. The psychologist said he was so dissociated, that's a medical term, from his body due to trauma that when she tried to teach him a breathing exercise, she said, quote, he had absolutely no awareness whatsoever of his breath even entering his body. He spent the majority of his adolescence, the specific wording used was more than half of each year of every year from ages 13 to 18, he spent under some form of legal restriction. So that could look like bail, court orders, juvenile detention. These related to a range of crimes, including break-ins and domestic violence towards his then girlfriend.
Okay.
So in short, a very troubled young person with what the coroner called poor impulse control, which she found was not helped by repeated detentions and restrictions. In the days before his death, he had threatened police officers with an axe and run away. That's in the town of Yuendamu.
Okay, so these findings have painted a picture of, as you said, or in the coroner's words, this very troubled young person who had a frequent engagement with law enforcement, with the system, a life really marred by inequality and
lack of support.
Yeah, that is certainly the picture that's been painted. So let's talk about the day that Kumanjayi Walker died, the day he was shot. Why was he in Yuendamu on that day?
He'd travelled there for a family funeral, but he was under conditions at that time that he needed to stay at a rehab facility in Alice Springs. Those were court-ordered conditions.
And this was an alcohol rehabilitation facility. Okay.
So as I touched on, he had
substance abuse.
Yeah, access to substances, exposure to substances from the beginning of his adolescence. So he was at an alcohol rehab facility in Alice Springs, which is about 300 k's from Yuendamu. He had to wear an ankle bracelet, an electronic monitoring bracelet. He cut it off his leg and travelled to Yuendamu for the family funeral. The coroner found this was because, quote, the desire to be with his family for funeral and ceremony obligations overrode any commitment to the conditions set by the court, even if it meant that his freedom would be short-lived.
Okay.
Breaching these conditions meant that police were bound to arrest him because he had breached court-ordered conditions.
Okay, so that's what the coroner found about Kumanjayi Walker, reflecting on his life, his adolescence, his background, the circumstances leading up to the day he died and what brought him to Yuendamu. What about Zachary Rolfe? This is the Northern Territory police officer involved.
Hi, I'm Zara. I'm the co-founder of the Daily Aus, and we started this company because we think news can be done differently. If you agree, you can hit subscribe. It's the best way to help us grow. Now, back to the video.
Yeah. So Coroner Elisabeth Armitage found that Walker and Rolfe's lives were, quote, far removed, those were her words, far removed from each other. She said Rolfe had had a loving childhood in Canberra, after which he joined the Defence Force and then sought to join the police. The way that he sought to join the police was that he applied to police forces in multiple states and in the Northern Territory, 4 different ones. On each of these applications, he either lied or failed to disclose important information. So this included previous drug use and charges relating to theft and to public nuisance and violent behaviour. When Queensland Police checked his records and found out that he had lied on this application, it blocked him from reapplying for 10 years.
That is really significant. I mean, I'm not sure how things go in most states, but the idea of someone wanting to be a police officer and applying to do so in 4 states and territories, having this criminal history that Zachary Rolfe had, it just seems like a very interesting point.
Yes.
But we do know ultimately he becomes a police officer in the Northern Territory. So I guess my question is, how did he do that? What kind of testing or process did they have in place?
So when he receives this notice from Queensland Police, at the same time his NT Police application is progressing, he undergoes a psychological test. It finds he's, quote, less likely than many others to own up to a mistake, is more aggressive than others, and while this was not yet a concern, it said he had the potential to resent authority figures. The inquest heard the NT Police Force did not check Rolfe's criminal record and considered him an excellent candidate. And also there doesn't seem to be evidence that they ever heard from Queensland Police about his restriction on applying there as well.
The 10-year ban.
The state next door.
And he was considered an excellent candidate after undergoing a series of tests that would include that psychological evaluation.
Yeah. As a police officer, the coroner found Rolfe, quote, had a tendency to rush into situations even if they were unsafe, and that he had been forceful in arresting Aboriginal boys and men, causing them injuries on a few occasions in the past. The inquest heard Rolfe sent videos recorded on his body-worn camera, body cam you might have heard it called, to others in his life. So showing them that footage from the camera.
So police footage recorded
as
during
part
shifts.
of an arrest.
Okay, and then he has shared that with
people in his
outside of the force.
Yes, including people outside of the force, of times that he had injured people he was arresting. The coroner found he, quote, thought this was funny.
Lucy, you mentioned at the top of the episode that ultimately the coroner did find racism was involved or that Zachary Rolfe was a racist officer.
That's right.
What was the nature of that finding specifically?
So Armitage found that Rolfe was a racist, and not only was he a racist, he was embedded in a racist culture in the NT police force. And I remember when we covered Rolfe's evidence at the inquest, that was a huge aspect of it, was this evidence that he himself brought to demonstrate a racist culture within the NT police force.
Yeah, I remember that at the time, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think his suggestion was you shouldn't be looking at me, the individual. You should be looking at systemic issues.
Yeah, that was something the coroner's report reflected as well. Armitage said she couldn't rule out the possibility that racism was a contributing factor to Walker's death. So she couldn't rule it in, but she couldn't rule it out.
Okay.
That I cannot exclude that possibility is a tragedy for Kumanjayi's family and community, who will always believe that racism played an integral part in his death, and it is a taint that may stain the NT police.
Okay, so Lucy, you've painted this picture for us of the life of Kumanjayi Walker, the life of Zachary Rolfe, the circumstances leading up to Walker's death, what kind of a police officer Rolfe was.
Yeah.
What did the coroner say or find about the day that they met, that fateful November 2019 arrest?
So Armitage found that, remember I mentioned earlier that their life experiences were so far removed from each other. She found that neither of them understood each other's reactions on that day. She also found that Rolfe and Earl should have planned the arrest quite carefully. Remember I mentioned that Kumanjayi had run at some police officers with an edged weapon in the previous days. Now, there was a plan in place for his arrest. It would have taken place at 5 a.m. on the 10th of November. A group of police went from Alice Springs to Yuendumu to execute this plan, which had been designed by senior officers. But once they got there, Rolfe overrode the plan and said they would go to arrest Walker that night, the 9th. Then the altercation that we've already described took place. So he's rushed in, as the coroner found he had a history of doing.
This is, I think, a really fundamental finding. As you mentioned, in the 600 pages of this report from the NT coroner, there is so much important detail there, but this almost sliding doors moment of what could have been, that there was a plan in place for an arrest the following day, yet the night before this took place and the shooting unfolded.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about the arrest that night?
Yeah. Oh, and before I do, I should just say we'll link the inquest in the show notes. And even though we have said it's more than 600 pages, it's actually not that difficult to read. It's written in fairly plain language.
And kind of bullet points by theme, I guess.
Yeah. So if it's not going to be, I mean, it's obviously emotionally difficult to read, but in terms of, it's not like a legal document. It's quite easy to read in that sense. So we will link it if people are interested in finding out more themselves. But back to the 9th of November 2019. So after Rolfe shot Walker, he and Earl, quote, dragged him to their police car. That's what the inquest heard. The officer's treatment of Walker distressed his family who were around and was not in line with police policy. At the Yuendumu police station, Rolfe gave Walker first aid.
This was after he'd already been shot several times. Yep.
So he's been dragged to the car, taken to the station.
Why wasn't he taken to a hospital?
So there's not a hospital in this remote town. There's a health clinic, but the health clinic was at that moment closed.
Right.
And the staff were elsewhere. But the coroner kind of had a mixed finding around how helpful they could have been, or even if he was airlifted to Alice Springs Hospital, how much time they necessarily had in order to treat his wounds. But at any rate, he was given first aid at the station, but they didn't have the supplies necessary. Walker's condition deteriorated and he died on the floor of a cell at the police station. While he was inside, a senior Aboriginal community police officer told the police officers inside to lock the station door because a crowd had gathered outside, having seen Walker being dragged to the police car and having heard gunshots. They were throwing rocks at the building. Walker's adopted mother remained at the house where he was shot. He had grandparents who lived very close to the police station, but they weren't notified that he had been arrested or that he had died until early the following morning, around the time that the arrest was planned to have taken place.
Okay. So it's all played out very publicly.
Yeah.
And I imagine incredibly distressing scenes and a highly emotional time for onlookers. But I suppose that helps the coroner paint this picture of exactly what ended up happening on that night. You said earlier that the coroner's job is to kind of lay out or identify the circumstances around a death of this nature and kind of take the learnings from that to make recommendations. So be that for government, for public health. What have some of the recommendations been from this inquest?
Yeah. Armitage made 32 formal recommendations for NT Police and the Territory Government. So those included reviewing youth services in Yuendumu and creating programs targeted at young people in the justice system in order to kind of reduce, quote, offending behaviour. She also recommended NT Police develop a policy of officers liaising with Aboriginal community officers, quote, in any planned interaction or arrest of an Aboriginal person, and also to intervene with officers who exhibit poor behaviour much earlier than they currently are.
So a lot of early intervention focused priorities and kind of lived experience or culturally informed practices.
Yeah.
What has the response been like to these recommendations?
Yeah. So the NT Police said it acknowledged the findings and recommendations. It said it will consider them. Acting NT Police Commissioner Martin Dole said the police extend their sympathies to Walker's family, but in the wake of that statement and in the wake of the inquest, community leader Ned Jampajinpa Hargraves has criticised Dole. He said he had promised to meet with the community after the findings were handed down, but Hargraves said Dole left Yuendumu without telling anyone that he was going.
Lucy, thank you so much for taking us through that. An incredibly distressing story, but a really important one, and one that I'm sure a lot of our audience have been keeping a close eye on over these last several years.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. A quick reminder, if this story has raised any concerns for you, particularly for First Nations listeners, you can call 13-YARN, that's 1392 76, or you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14, and we will pop some links to resources in today's show notes. We'll be back a little later on today with the evening headlines, but until then, look after yourself.